Hi everyone! Thank you for joining us on another episode of Remarkable Spirit Memories of a Medium. My name is Gabrielle Gardner and I am a medium. That means that I see, feel, and hear the souls of those who are no longer residing in a physical body, or in more traditional terms, they have died. Death, as I have come to know it, most definitely is not the end. It is simply the turning of a page after completing a chapter. Today's show is extra special because it's the final episode of Season 1. It has been an absolute privilege getting to tell you all about some of the most remarkable souls that I have encountered in my work with Spirit. And today I would like to share another one of the remarkable stories with you. This one, in truth, is one of the most beautiful things that I have ever seen from Spirit. And I'm very excited to share it with you today. The following is about my time with a sweet but deeply wounded soul whose time in the in-between space was a part of my life for 12 years. Before I understood what I could do or how to do it, I had picked up this soul every time that we passed a specific location where his death occurred from the time that I was young. And I believe that my experiences with this soul for so many years of my life led me to this place where I am now, of working with souls in the non-physical. And I don't think it's any sort of coincidence that this year he finally shifted and connected to the guides and crossed into light in one of the most beautiful crossing ceremonies that I have ever been a part of. I don't remember much of my life without feeling him on a familiar and almost daily drive between my house and my grandparents' house. And it wasn't until I got to know him and see his experience this year that I realized how much he impacted me on this spirit-guided path. And now I want to thank him. I want to share his story with you. I want to share his truly remarkable energy and how after years in the in-between, which felt like just moments to him, he was able to cross into the most beautiful warmth and love that I have ever seen on the other side. It was truly a magical experience seeing his crossing and incredible soul healing take place. It was all facilitated by his loved ones in spirit and guides. This is about my time with Chris, one of the kindest souls that I have ever met. Again, I will be sharing excerpts from the journal entries that I make to record my time with Spirit. While on my way home from my grandparents' house around 11 p.m. with my mom driving, we passed a place where I always pick up the imprint of an overdose death. Every single time that we passed this place for years, I felt an angry, cold energy on the sidewalk by a busy street, and it always made me nauseous and uncomfortable. But for 12 years of passing that spot, not once did I ever see, hear, or talk to the soul whose energy I was picking up on. After years of feeling the energy, I knew nothing about who he was or why he remained there. I just knew it was a man who died of an overdose, and his anger and coldness blocked anything else. But something shifted on that night, and to this day, I still don't know what caused the shift, but everything suddenly changed. My guides chose that night to connect me to Chris, and it quickly became one of the most beautiful experiences I ever had with Spirit. But it all began with one of the most uncomfortable things that I have ever experienced from Spirit. As we drove past this familiar spot, for the first time, I didn't feel Chris's anger and coldness. I felt a sharp pain on the inside of my right elbow. And then I felt a needle sliding into my vein. It was the most tangible, solid sensation I've ever felt from Spirit. It truly felt like a needle had gone into my arm, and I knew it was the imprint of drug use from that soul. I told my guides to stop. I didn't want to feel that, and the sensation faded. I tuned into his energy and could feel that it was bigger. It was like he had taken some of his barriers down. When a soul does this of their own free will, the guides show that it's like how a star burns brighter just before it transforms into something new. We got home that night, and our house was filled with a warmth that I had only felt on the evenings in which my family was near and around for support, often after my loved ones had passed. And I realized that my own family was also coming through to facilitate this process with Chris, along with his guides and my guides. I sat down to meditate and tune in as the guides tapped me into Spirit, and I felt my family sitting around the room with me. I think that because of how thick the walls were that Chris had built around his heart pain and around his trauma, the guides brought in as many people who could see him and love him and support him as they could find, and it was remarkable. And then the guides showed me Chris's experience. At 9 years old, Chris's mom had died of cancer just before Christmas. That Christmas was dark and cold for Chris. His dad had been completely emotionally distant and shut down after his mom had died. And on that day, that little boy hurt, and he felt lonely and empty. The guide showed me that Christmas following the loss of his mom created a soul fracture in Chris, and he was never given the support that he needed to heal that wound. The guides then showed me flashes of significant moments in Chris's life. By 10 years old, Chris's dad had fully turned to alcohol to avoid feeling his own pain, and on the worst of nights, he became abusive. At 11, Chris's dad decided to stop coming home for multiple nights a week, and Chris was left alone to grow up too fast. At 13, Chris began to skip school and smoke weed to deal with his heart pain. At 15, Chris experienced a second soul fracture when he trusted an adult and that adult took advantage of a teenager looking for love. Unable to deal with his experiences, and again unsupported, at 16, Chris began using heroin and dropped out of high school. At 17, Chris no longer valued himself or life. He was homeless and desperate to numb his pain, so he took anything and everything to some days feel nothing at all, and to sometimes break out of that empty, cold feeling inside to feel anything close to warmth. But at 19, warmth and real love returned to Chris's life for the first time in 10 years, and a little piece of his heart was healed when he found an abandoned black lab and instantly fell in love and cared for him. This dog became Chris's reason to keep living. He loved this dog with everything that he had. They survived on the streets together, sometimes stealing to get by, but never using aggression or violence. They mostly stuck to themselves, and Chris had 7 years of surviving. But he felt a deep soul connection with the dog that kept him tethered to life. And then the guide showed that when Chris was 26, his dog, that was Chris's entire world, was hit by a car one night and died instantly. Chris couldn't handle that. That sudden and traumatic loss of the sole source of warmth and stability and love in his life. And that kicked off a spiral of heavier drug use. Chris became so desperate for anything that made him hurt less, to push the pain away, that he became fully dependent on drugs, and he felt completely alone in this world. The guide showed that his mom's death, his dad's alcohol abuse, his dad's absence, and the abuse from a stranger, a loss of his best friend and companion, all piled on top of Chris becoming unbearable for him unless he was using something that altered his mind. Going through all of this and never receiving any kind of support, he felt hollow. He felt like everyone he loved had either abandoned him or left him, and all he was looking for was stable love and kindness. When the guide showed me Chris's life, they showed me that he had lived out the duration of his time in body on the streets, mostly alone, mostly angry, and mostly altered by substance. He had never been able to move past the version of him that was the 9-year-old boy who lost his mom just before Christmas. And they showed that Christmas for the rest of Chris's life had been a source of tremendous pain. At 27, less than a year after the death of his best friend and companion, Chris overdosed in the middle of the night. Overdosed in the middle of the night while sitting on the sidewalk where I met him in spirit. I opened my eyes from the meditation session with my guides where I'd seen all this, and Chris was sitting on the floor with me. He no longer felt cold and angry. That energy was being released, and what was left in Chris was just the sadness. I knew then that the aggression and anger that I had felt for years when passing by that spot where he died was just his defense mechanism. And see, Chris had ended up in the in-between space, not because of his drug use or any of the other reasons that come to mind. None of those make a difference on whether or not a soul moves to the place after this place. Chris was in the in-between because he believed that everything good just disappears, and he believed that everyone is just gone when they die. He had no trust in the guides, even when they showed him that they were there to help him, and he was afraid to let them in. They had attempted to connect him to his mom when he died, and she was there to connect to him, but his beliefs that everything and everyone just leaves were so firm that he wouldn't see or hear the guides or his mom because he was afraid to love again. He believed that everything he loved was taken away. And then I knew the only way Chris was going to move through it was to talk about it. For whatever reason, sometimes a soul just needs another human to simply acknowledge their experience. So I sat there on the floor with Chris and listened. He told me about his life in his own words, and I realized that nobody had ever listened to his story before. Nobody had ever acknowledged his pain, and that was what he needed. And eventually we got to the true sticking point for Chris. Nobody had acknowledged the deep pain he'd held when his mom had died when he was a young boy. He had felt alone in that loss, and nobody had been there to help him through his grief when he was young. And then something that I've never seen before happened. The 20-something, drug-addicted, angry, homeless man who had initially terrified me when his energy came into mine began to shift. It softened and it lightened, and in my mind's eye I could see that Chris was transforming into the 9-year-old boy that was sitting alone in his Christmas PJs that his mom had bought him just before she died. And that 9-year-old Chris was sitting on the floor in front of a dark, undecorated tree that they had got just before she died. And that moment, sitting alone by the tree, had become one of Chris's core heart pain memories. And it was a moment that he'd never been able to heal in his life. As Chris was pulled back there, I felt the guides flooding in to support him in that moment and hold his little heart's pain. So I looked at that 9-year-old version of Chris sitting there on the floor next to the dark tree, and I said, "Chris, the guides would like to show you your mom. Would you like to see her?" He looked at me surprised and nodded. And I smiled and said, "Good, let's go see her tomorrow." By that time, it was almost 2 a.m., so I needed to sleep, but I knew that the guides would help Chris continue to release more overnight so that the crossing could happen the next afternoon. I spent the morning gathering the supplies that the guides showed would be needed for Chris's crossing, and as I moved about the house, I felt an incredible, excited anticipation coming from Spirit. There were a lot of souls and guides who were coming in to help Chris connect to his mom and finally get to where he was meant to be. The warmth emanating from Spirit for Chris was breathtaking, and it was moving me to tears before the ceremony even began. After a few hours of gathering and preparing, I knew that it was time, and I lit a candle and told Chris that he could come join me now as I began to lay out the grid. 20-something-year-old Chris came in, looking sad, but his energy was much lighter than it had ever been, and I knew that he was ready. He sat by the table as the guides created the place for his soul to heal, and for him to connect to those he loved in spirit. As I worked, the guides gave me the insight that the reason I never clearly saw Chris for those 12 years that I felt his energy was because that version of Chris, who died on the street of an overdose, wasn't really him. That was a wounded shell of Chris. Who Chris really was the 9-year-old boy just before his mom died. And suddenly, that was who was sitting in the chair next to the table. I again saw that memory of him sitting by the dark tree, and I knew Chris was seeing the same thing. The guide said he must go back there to find her now. I didn't understand, but I turned to Chris and asked if he could go there for just a minute. He didn't want to go into that memory, and he said, "I don't like it there." I said, "I know, but this is important, and it will help." After a minute, he agreed, and I felt him move his energy into that memory. At that moment, I felt a guide come into the room next to me, and that guide showed me the moment Chris's dog had died. And I felt Chris's heart break as he held his best friend and sobbed on the pavement. The guide said, "It's time for him to see them now. They've been waiting a long time to see him." I saw 9-year-old Chris in that memory by the tree, and he had tears on his face. He had seen that memory of losing his dog too. And he said, "That was Jack. That was my Jack." I said, "I think the guides are showing you that because Jack wants to help you now too." I said, "As soon as you're ready to see that there's more than this," and I pointed to the dark room he was sitting in. I said, "As soon as you're ready to see that there's more light than this, you'll see it." And then we were both pulled into a different moment, and I saw a flash of Chris standing over his body on the sidewalk. A memory of sorts of the moment of his passing. As he stood there looking, he said, "That doesn't even look like me." As he was going through the experience, I felt a warm energy coming in, and I knew it was his mom coming to be with him. But Chris still couldn't feel her yet. Then something truly beautiful began to happen. Something I've never seen before. Chris's mom used his old memory, the soul-fracturing memory of that dark Christmas, to connect with him and enter into his energy. And then she began to change it into something new. Instead of Chris sitting by the dark tree, the tree was suddenly filled with beautiful light, and the home was full of warmth. Then I saw the new memory his mom was creating for her son. I'm crying because it was so beautiful. This was the most joy I've ever felt from Spirit. She was sitting crisscross on the floor by the tree, and she was holding a small, wiggling little black puppy. And his mom was prepared to give this puppy version of Jack to Chris as soon as he could see him. My attention was pulled back to Chris standing on the sidewalk as he looked at his body. I said, "Chris, that isn't you anymore. You don't need to stay here." He said, "But there's nowhere else for me to go." I said, "No, Chris, there is somewhere much better than this for you." I said, "Can you look back at that time again? One more time." He said angrily, "Why? It just hurts." I said, "I know, but just try one more time." He sighed and shifted his focus into that moment that had been so dark and the source of so much of his pain for so many years. And suddenly it was like I was seeing it from the view of the guides. That new place, and that new moment that his mom had created for him. It was Chris's peaceful place that he deserved to know. I saw that 9-year-old version of Chris coming down the stairs and turning the corner. And his eyes just lit up when instead of seeing that dark, cold room, he saw his mom sitting there by that warmly lit tree with Jack the puppy. He ran to her and jumped into her arms, and she laughed and embraced him. I felt that hug of a mother who is reunited with her son. And it was one of the warmest, most loving things that I've ever felt. And then she popped the little puppy in his lap, and I felt that fur, and it was incredible, and it was perfect. My attention was pulled back to the sidewalk where Chris had died for just a second, and I saw the adult version of him looking down at himself. And then he looked up and he smiled, and he turned and walked into a bright light. And the second he walked into that light, I was back looking at the young boy version of him with his mom and Jack. I felt the adult version of him say, "That never was me. This is me." And he stepped into that new place where he could fully be with his mom. It was like he integrated the adult version and the teen version and the child version of him all back into one solid soul in that moment. It was like life had fractured him, but he was able to put the pieces of himself back together with his mom and Jack. My guides let me watch for just another minute as Chris's soul was filled with and surrounded by his mom's love. And they just sat there playing together. It was absolutely beautiful. He had integrated his pains and healed. And he was with the ones that he loved most again, experiencing all of the happiness and love that they were all meant to know. This experience with Chris, it's one of my favorites because it's so full of the evidence that we will all be reunited with the ones that we love. After his mom had died, Chris had hated the holidays because they only reminded him how much his heart hurt. But in the end of his life, in the time he moved fully into spirit, his little piece of bliss unexpectedly became a very special Christmas morning with his mom and his puppy Jack. I couldn't think of a better way to end this season than by sharing one of the most remarkable soul transformations, one of the most incredible healings from spirit, and one of the most beautiful reunions with loved ones that in the place of warmth and light and love that I've ever seen. Spirit truly is amazing. Remember that we are meant to live this life fully until the very last breath that our lungs can take, and we are here to feel and share kindness and love with everyone else that we meet in this life. And don't ever forget that the remarkable energy of spirit is all around us. As always, I am honored to get to do this work, and I'm eternally grateful to the guides and the angels and the source from which we all come. My name is Gabrielle Gardner, and this has been another episode of Remarkable Spirit.